Good evening, all, and welcome back to Untold Fears. Tonight, we are venturing into the mist-shrouded forests and forgotten trails of the Pacific Northwest, where 10 people discovered that some encounters leave scars deeper than any wound. From vanishing hikers whose footprints lead to nowhere, to basement tenants with unspeakable secrets, to voices calling from beyond the grave on late-night radio. These stories will remind you that the most terrifying monsters are often the ones we never see coming. What you are about to hear is not fiction. These are real accounts from real people who stumbled into darkness they were never meant to find. 10 disturbing tales from Washington, Oregon, and the deep wilderness between, where the trees grow thick enough to hide anything, and the fog rolls in heavy enough to swallow the truth. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe to Untold Fears for daily true horror content that will keep you up at night. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when the darkness calls. Now, let us step into the shadows of the Pacific Northwest deep woods, where civilization ends and terror begins. I had what most people would consider a normal childhood, let me tell you. But there is one thing that happened when I was 17 that changed everything I thought I knew about the Pacific Northwest, about disappearances, and about my own brother. Have you ever heard of the missing 411 cases? There is this researcher named David Paulides who has documented thousands of mysterious disappearances in national parks and wilderness areas across North America. When I first discovered his work about 5 years ago, I sat at my computer until 3 a.m, reading case after case, my hands shaking so badly I could barely scroll. My husband found me crying in our home office, unable to speak, because every single pattern Paulides described matched exactly what happened to my brother James in the summer of 2009. People do not realize that the Pacific Northwest has one of the highest rates of unexplained disappearances in the entire country. Hikers vanish without a trace. Search and rescue teams find nothing. Families are left with questions that never get answered. But what disturbs me most is not just the disappearances themselves. It is the patterns, the strange weather that rolls in, the dogs that refuse to track, the items found miles away in impossible locations, and in some cases, like my brother James, the evidence that suggests something was watching, waiting, following. It was late July, and James had just turned 19. He was home from his first year at Portland State University, studying forestry of all things. He loved the outdoors more than anyone I have ever known. Our parents used to joke that he was born in the wrong century, that he should have been a mountain man or a wilderness guide. James knew how to read topographical maps, how to navigate by compass, how to identify edible plants and animal tracks. He was not some amateur who wandered off trail without preparation. That is what made everything that happened so completely impossible to explain. We decided to do a day hike at Multnomah Falls. It is one of the most popular trails in Oregon, practically in Portland's backyard. Thousands of people visit every year. The main waterfall is right there off the historic highway, 620 feet of cascading water that you can see from the parking lot. But James wanted to go beyond the tourist areas. He wanted to hike up to Larch Mountain, about 7 miles round trip, with some decent elevation gain, but nothing we had not done a dozen times before. We started early, around 7 a.m, trying to beat the crowds. The day was perfect. Clear blue sky, temperature in the mid-70s, absolutely ideal hiking conditions. We made good time up the paved trail to Benson Bridge, then continued on the dirt path that winds up through the forest. James was in high spirits, talking about his classes, about a girl he had met, about his plans to work for the Forest Service after graduation. I remember thinking how happy he seemed, how adult he had become. He was not my annoying older brother anymore. He was becoming someone I genuinely respected and enjoyed spending time with. We reached the junction, where the trail splits about 2 hours in. One path continues to Larch Mountain. The other loops back down through a different section of forest. James checked his map and suggested we take the loop trail on the way down to make it more interesting. I agreed. We stopped for water and snacks, took some photos. Everything was completely normal. There were even a few other hikers around, a couple in their 50s who chatted with us about the wildflowers. That is when I noticed the weather changing. It should not have changed. The forecast called for clear skies all day, but fog was rolling in, thick and fast, moving through the trees in a way that seemed almost purposeful. The temperature dropped at least 15 degrees in a matter of minutes. James noticed it too. He frowned at the sky, or what we could see of it through the increasingly dense canopy and fog. "That is weird," he said. "This came out of nowhere." The other hikers had already started back down. James suggested we should probably head down too, take the direct route instead of the loop since visibility was getting bad. I agreed immediately. Something about that fog felt wrong. I know that sounds dramatic, but I've hiked in fog before and this was different. It had a weight to it, almost a presence, and it was silent. Completely silent. No birds, no insects, no wind. Just our footsteps and our breathing. We started down the trail. James was ahead of me by about 10 feet, which was normal. He was taller, his stride was longer, and he always led on hikes. The fog got thicker. I could barely see his backpack in front of me. He slowed down, and I heard him say something I could not quite make out. "What?" I called. "I said there is something weird about this trail," James replied, his voice sounding muffled and distant, even though he was right there. "I do not remember this section." "We came up this way," I said, but even as I said it, I felt uncertain. The trees looked different. The trail seemed narrower. "I'm going to scout ahead about 50 yards, see if I recognize anything," James said. "You wait right here. Do not move. If I'm not back in 5 minutes, head back up to the junction and wait there." I should have said no. I should have insisted we stay together. But James was experienced, and 50 yards is nothing. I could still hear his footsteps on the trail ahead, moving away into the fog. I checked my watch, waited. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3. At 4 minutes, I called out, "James." Nothing. "James." Still nothing. At 5 minutes, I started forward, calling his name. The trail continued straight ahead, no branches, no way he could have gotten turned around. At what I estimated was about 50 yards, I found his red bandana lying in the middle of the trail. James always wore that bandana on hikes, always. He would not have just dropped it. I picked it up. It was damp with fog, but otherwise normal. I kept going, shouting his name now, not caring how panicked I sounded. The trail went on for another 100 yards, then opened into a small clearing I definitely did not remember from the hike up, and that is where I saw them, footprints in the dirt. But they were wrong. James wore size 12 hiking boots with a distinctive waffle tread pattern. These prints were similar in size and stride, matching his pace, but the tread pattern was different, smoother, and they ran parallel to his prints, about 3 feet to the left, as if someone or something had been walking directly alongside him. I followed both sets of prints across the clearing. On the other side, James's prints just stopped. Not at the tree line, not at a rock scramble, not at any logical point. They just ended in the middle of open ground, his last step captured clearly in the soft earth. The other prints, the wrong prints, continued into the forest alone. I ran back to the junction completely hysterical. I called 911. Within 2 hours, the place was swarming with search and rescue teams. They brought dogs, helicopters, thermal imaging equipment. They searched for 3 days straight. Hundreds of volunteers combed the area. They found nothing. No trace of James beyond that clearing with the impossible footprints, which by the time I brought investigators back, had been washed away by a sudden rain shower. On day 4, they found his backpack. It was 3.7 miles from where he disappeared, in a location the search teams had already covered twice. The backpack was arranged carefully against a tree, all the items removed and placed in a circle around it. His water bottle, his first aid kit, his map and compass, his phone, his wallet, his keys, even the snacks from his pockets, all arranged in a perfect circle, each item exactly the same distance from the next. His phone was dead, but the police were able to extract data from it. The last photo he took was time-stamped at 10:47 a.m., about 5 minutes before he disappeared. It was a picture taken from his chest pocket, pointing upward, showing the forest canopy through the fog. When they enhanced the image, there was something in the background between the trees. A shape, human-sized but wrong somehow, too tall and too thin, watching from about 20 yards away. But here is the detail that still haunts me. They found James's journal in his backpack. He always kept a hiking journal, noting trails and observations. The last entry was dated the day before our hike, but there was another entry after that on the next page, in handwriting that was similar to James's, but not quite right. It said, "The fog is not weather. The fog is a door. I see them now. I understand why they have been following me. I am supposed to go with them. I'm supposed to see what they want to show me. If anyone finds this, tell my sister I did not mean to leave her alone in that clearing, but they would only take one of us, and it had to be me. They have been watching me for weeks." I expected the police to investigate thoroughly, to bring in handwriting experts, to treat this as evidence of something deeply disturbing. But do you know what happened? The detective in charge told me that James probably had some kind of psychotic break, that he wandered off trail in confusion, that the journal entry proved he was experiencing delusions. Case closed. Missing person, presumed dead, likely fell into a ravine or river, and the body was not recovered. They stopped searching after 2 weeks. But I did not stop searching. I have spent the last 16 years researching disappearances in the Pacific Northwest. I found a forum online, families of other people who vanished in similar circumstances. The details are almost identical. Sudden fog, strange sounds, that feeling of being watched, items found arranged in patterns, and in some cases journals or notes left behind describing them, or the watchers, or the ones who walk alongside. I went back to that clearing dozens of times over the years. I brought my own cameras, my own equipment. I measured everything, took soil samples, interviewed other hikers who reported strange experiences in that area, and what I found was that over a 12-mile radius around Multnomah Falls, there have been 17 unexplained disappearances since 1995. 17 people who simply vanished without a trace. The authorities do not connect them. They treat each case as isolated, as accidents, as people who were unprepared or unlucky. But I connected them. I mapped every disappearance, and they form a pattern, a specific geometric pattern around certain areas of the forest, places where the trees grow in unusual formations, places where compasses spin, places where dogs refuse to go. Last month, I was contacted by a ranger who worked the search for James back in 2009. He is retired now, and he told me something he had never put in any official report. He said that on the second day of the search, he was working a grid pattern in a remote section of forest about 5 miles from where James disappeared. He came across a tree that had been carved with symbols he did not recognize. And at the base of that tree was a pile of items: watches, wallets, phones, car keys, backpacks, at least 20 of them. He radioed it in, marked the location on his GPS, and went to get his supervisor. When they returned 30 minutes later, everything was gone. The tree was bare. The ground showed no sign of disturbance. His GPS unit failed to record the coordinates. He said it was like the location had just erased itself. He never reported it officially because he knew no one would believe him. But he believed what he saw, and he wanted me to know that James was not alone, and that whatever took him is still out there, still watching, still following people through the fog. My brother James disappeared on July 23, 2009, at approximately 10:50 in the morning on a popular hiking trail in perfect weather conditions. He was experienced, prepared, and cautious. He vanished in the span of 5 minutes while I was less than 100 yards away. His case remains unsolved. The official explanation is that he suffered a mental health crisis and fell into a ravine, but I know the truth. Something lives in those forests. Something that can make people vanish. Something that arranges their belongings in circles and writes in their journals and walks alongside them until the fog rolls in thick enough to take them. I still hike in the Pacific Northwest. I will not let fear keep me out of the places James loved, but I never hike alone anymore. I never hike when fog is in the forecast. And when I am on the trail and I get that feeling that I am being watched, I do not investigate. I turn around immediately and I walk back the way I came, and I do not stop walking until I reach my car, because I know what happens to people who keep going. I know what happens when the fog rolls in and the forest goes silent and something starts walking alongside you in the trees. I know because I almost found out that day with James. And the only reason it took him instead of me is that somewhere, somehow, he made a choice to go alone into whatever was waiting in that fog, and I have to live with that choice every single day. My wife Emily has worked for Washington State Parks for the past 12 years. She is a facilities maintenance specialist, which means she handles everything from plumbing repairs to electrical work at historic sites across the state. It is not glamorous work, but Emily loves it. She gets to spend her days in beautiful locations preserving pieces of history, usually in peaceful solitude. At least, that is what she thought until she was assigned to Cape Disappointment Lighthouse in the fall of 2018. What she encountered there still keeps her up at night, and honestly, it has changed both of our lives in ways I never expected. Cape Disappointment sits at the mouth of the Columbia River, right where it meets the Pacific Ocean. It is one of the most treacherous stretches of water in the world, known as the Graveyard of the Pacific. Over 2,000 vessels have wrecked there since the 1800s. The lighthouse was built in 1856, making it the oldest functioning lighthouse in Washington state. Well, I say functioning, but that is not entirely accurate anymore. It was automated decades ago. There is no lightkeeper. No one lives there. It is just a historic structure that tourists can visit during the day, and maintenance workers like Emily service on a rotating schedule. In October of 2018, Emily got a work order for Cape Disappointment. Routine maintenance check. Inspect the structure, test the backup systems, make sure everything was in order before the winter storms hit. It was supposed to be a 4-hour job maximum. She planned to arrive at 3 in the afternoon and be done well before dark. She had done dozens of these lighthouse inspections. They were straightforward, peaceful, almost meditative work. She arrived right on schedule, parked in the small lot near the trail that leads to the lighthouse. It was a gray day, typical for the Washington coast in autumn. Low clouds, mist in the air, the sound of waves crashing against the rocks below. Emily grabbed her tool bag and inspection checklist and made the short walk to the lighthouse. The structure rises 53 feet from its base. White tower with a black lantern room at the top. It looks picturesque in photographs, almost quaint. But standing at the base, looking up, Emily told me it felt different that day. Heavy, somehow. Oppressive. She unlocked the door with her master key and stepped inside. The interior of the lighthouse is exactly what you would expect. Circular brick walls, a spiral staircase winding up the center, small windows letting in gray light. The keeper's quarters are on the ground floor, preserved but locked off from the public. Emily started her inspection there, checking for water damage, testing outlets, making sure the dehumidifiers were running properly. Everything seemed normal. That is when she heard the footsteps above her. Heavy boots on metal stairs. Someone was climbing the spiral staircase. Emily froze. She was supposed to be alone. The lighthouse was closed to visitors. No other maintenance workers were scheduled. She called out, "Hello? Facilities maintenance here. Is someone up there?" The footsteps stopped. Silence. Emily waited, her heart pounding. Maybe it was another parks employee she had not been informed about. Maybe a supervisor checking up on her work. She called out again, "I'm going to come up. Let me know if you are working on something so I do not get in your way." No response. Emily made her way to the spiral staircase and started climbing. The steps are steep and narrow, and they clang with each footstep, echoing through the tower. She climbed slowly, listening. About halfway up, she smelled something that did not belong. Pipe tobacco. Strong and sweet. Completely out of place in a building that had been smoke-free for decades and was closed to the public. She reached the second level where the old keeper's quarters used to be, rooms that were now used for storage and equipment. The smell was stronger here, and that is when she saw it through the frosted glass window that looked into the small equipment room. A shadow. The silhouette of a man, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing what looked like a uniform with a peaked cap. The figure was standing perfectly still, facing away from her. Emily's training kicked in, security protocols. If there was an intruder in the lighthouse, she needed to get out and call the police, not confront them alone. She backed away slowly, quietly toward the stairs. But the moment she moved, the shadow moved too. It turned to face her. And even though she could not see details through the frosted glass, she could feel it watching her, studying her. The temperature in the stairwell dropped so suddenly that Emily could see her breath. She ran. She will admit that without shame. She ran down those spiral stairs faster than she had ever moved in her life, her tool bag banging against her leg, her breath coming in gasps. She reached the ground floor, bolted through the door, and did not stop running until she reached her truck. She sat there for 10 minutes, hands shaking on the steering wheel, trying to calm down enough to call her supervisor. But here is the thing. Emily is not the type of person who scares easily. She is practical, skeptical, scientifically minded. She does not believe in ghosts, or at least she did not. So instead of calling her supervisor and admitting she had fled the job site, she called me. I was at work, but I could hear the panic in her voice. I told her to wait there. I would drive down. It would take about 2 hours. While she waited, Emily did what she always does when she's stressed. She researched. She pulled up the history of Cape Disappointment Lighthouse on her phone, and what she found made her blood run cold. The lighthouse had a keeper named Captain Joel Munson, who served from 1871 to 1892. He was known for his dedication to duty, never missing a single night of keeping the light burning, even through the worst storms the Pacific could throw at that coast. In 1892, the lighthouse service sent his replacement, a younger man named Charles Ballard, but Captain Munson refused to leave his post. He barricaded himself in the lighthouse, claiming that only he knew how to properly maintain the light, that Ballard was incompetent and would cause ships to wreck. They had to forcibly remove him. It took the local sheriff and 4 deputies to drag Captain Munson out of that lighthouse. He was ranting about his duty, about ships depending on him, about how the light would fail without him there. They took him to his home down the coast. 3 days later, concerned neighbors found him missing. They searched everywhere. Finally, someone thought to check the lighthouse. They found Captain Munson at the top of the tower in the lantern room, sitting in the keeper's chair, dead. He had been deceased for at least 2 days, based on the condition of his body. But the light was still burning, still rotating, still performing exactly as it should. No one knew how he had gotten back into the locked lighthouse. No one knew how he had operated the light while dead. The official report called it a suicide, said he must have broken in and died of exposure or a heart condition. But the lighthouse keepers who came after him all reported the same things. Footsteps on the stairs when no one was there. The smell of pipe tobacco. Doors that locked and unlocked themselves. And most disturbing, the distinct feeling of being watched by someone who disapproved of how they were doing their job. By the time I arrived, Emily had composed herself. She showed me the research she had found. We discussed options. I suggested we go back in together, finish the inspection. Emily is not a quitter. and leaving a job incomplete goes against everything she stands for professionally. Plus, it was getting close to sunset, and she would have to come back anyway. Better to finish it now than dread coming back alone. We approached the lighthouse together. The door was still unlocked from when Emily had run out. We stepped inside. The air felt different now, charged somehow. Emily led the way up the spiral stairs, and I followed close behind. The smell of pipe tobacco was faint, but definitely present. We checked every level, every room. Nothing. No one. But in the old keeper's quarters on the second level, we found something that had not been there during Emily's first inspection. On the desk in the corner, someone had arranged items in a very specific way. An old pipe that had been in a display case downstairs was now sitting on the desk, still warm to the touch. Next to it was a logbook, open to an entry from March 15, 1889, written in Captain Munson's handwriting. The entry read, "Heavy fog tonight. Ships will founder without proper attention to the light. Ballard is not ready. Ballard will never be ready. I will not leave my post. Duty is duty, in life or after." Emily and I looked at each other. Neither of us had moved that pipe. Neither of us had opened that logbook. The display case downstairs was locked, and Emily had the only key. We went back down to check. The case was still locked, still sealed, but the pipe was definitely missing from inside it. We finished the inspection as quickly as possible. Emily checked off every item on her list with shaking hands. When we reached the lantern room at the top, we both felt it. That presence, standing right behind us, the overwhelming sensation of someone watching, evaluating, judging our work. The temperature was at least 20 degrees colder than the rest of the tower. And when we turned to go back down the stairs, we both saw it at the same time. Footprints in the dust on the floor. Fresh footprints, boot prints, large and heavy, leading from the top of the stairs to where we were standing, then stopping. As if someone had walked right up behind us and was standing there still. But there was no one. Just those footprints appearing in the dust, and the smell of pipe tobacco, and the crushing weight of being watched by something that refused to accept it was no longer needed. We left. Emily filed her report, noted everything was in working order, said nothing about what we experienced. But the next time Cape Disappointment came up on the maintenance rotation, Emily traded assignments with a co-worker. She has never been back. But here is what disturbs me most. Other maintenance workers have reported similar experiences. Always the footsteps, always the tobacco smell, always that presence in the lantern room. One worker quit after he heard a voice behind him say, "You're doing it wrong." Another found all of his tools rearranged while he was in a different part of the lighthouse, organized in the exact way they would have been stored in the 1880s. Washington State Parks has an unofficial policy now. No one goes to Cape Disappointment Lighthouse alone. Always in pairs, always finished before sunset. And never, ever question the footsteps on the stairs or the shadow in the keeper's quarters. Because Captain Munson never left his post, he refused to leave in 1892, and he refuses to leave now. Death was not enough to relieve him of duty, and anyone who enters that lighthouse is subject to his inspection, his judgment, his eternal vigil. Emily still works for state parks. She still loves her job. But she has nightmares about that lighthouse, about climbing those spiral stairs and finding Captain Munson waiting at the top, finally ready to show himself fully, finally ready to explain what duty means to someone who will never leave their post, not even when their body has been dead for over a century. And the worst part, last month, Emily got a call from a current maintenance worker at Cape Disappointment. The automated light system failed. For 3 hours, in the middle of the night during a storm, the lighthouse was completely dark. Ships were in danger. The Coast Guard was preparing to send out warnings. And then suddenly, the light came back on, working perfectly. When maintenance crews investigated the next morning, they found the backup manual system had been activated from inside the lantern room, a system that requires someone to physically wind the mechanism and light the lamp, a system that has not been used since the lighthouse was automated in 1964. And in the keeper's log, which is kept now only for historical purposes, there was a new entry in handwriting that matched Captain Munson's from the 1880s. It said, "Light restored, duty maintained, still on watch." Have you ever heard of Malaysia Airlines Flight 370? It disappeared in 2014 with 239 people on board, vanishing without a trace somewhere over the Indian Ocean. The mystery of what happened to that plane has haunted aviation experts and families for years. Debris washed up on distant shores, but the main wreckage has never been found. Theories range from mechanical failure to hijacking to something far stranger. When that story dominated the news, I could barely watch the coverage. Because my Uncle Michael disappeared under eerily similar circumstances 8 years earlier in 2006. But his plane was only supposed to fly 40 miles. Uncle Michael was not some weekend hobbyist pilot. He had been a certified flight instructor for 23 years. He had logged over 15,000 flight hours. He had flown in every type of weather condition the Pacific Northwest could throw at a pilot, from dense fog to ice storms to high winds. He knew the airspace around the Olympic Peninsula like most people know their own neighborhood. He was meticulous about pre-flight checks, about filing flight plans, about following every regulation and safety protocol. My father used to joke that Michael was so careful he probably checked his toothbrush for structural integrity before using it. On March 8, 2006, Michael was scheduled to take a routine training flight with a student pilot. The plan was simple: take off from Port Angeles, fly a standard pattern over the Olympic Peninsula, practice some basic maneuvers, and land back at Port Angeles. Total flight time estimated at 90 minutes. Weather conditions were perfect. Clear skies, light winds, visibility unlimited. It was the kind of day every pilot hopes for, especially when training a student. Michael arrived at the airfield at 9 in the morning. The plane was a Cessna 172, one of the most reliable single-engine aircraft ever built. He performed his pre-flight inspection with his usual thoroughness. Everything checked out perfectly. Fuel was topped off. Oil levels good. All instruments functioning. He filed his flight plan with the tower, noting his intended route and estimated return time. The student pilot, a young man named Ryan, who was working toward his private pilot license, arrived at 9:30. They went over the flight plan together, discussed the maneuvers they would practice, and climbed into the plane. They took off at 10:15. The tower confirmed departure, and Michael's voice came through clear and professional as always. Port Angeles Tower, Cessna N7342L, departing runway 27, climbing to 4,500 feet. The tower acknowledged. Everything was completely routine. Michael checked in again at 10:25, confirming he was at altitude and beginning the training exercise. Again, nothing unusual. His voice was calm, measured, exactly what you would expect from an experienced instructor. At 10:32, Michael's voice came over the radio again, but this time there was something in his tone. Not panic exactly, more like confusion. He said, "Port Angeles Tower, Cessna 42L, we have traffic at our 9 o'clock position, approximately same altitude. Do you show anything on radar?" The tower responded immediately. "Cessna 42L, negative. We show no traffic in your vicinity. Can you describe what you are seeing?" There was a pause. Then Michael came back, and now there was definite concern in his voice. "Tower, I have visual on an aircraft in formation with us. It is matching our speed and altitude, distance approximately 200 feet. The student confirms visual as well. It is not showing any navigation lights or markings. Please advise." The tower operator, who had been doing this job for 12 years, felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He checked his radar again. Nothing. He contacted SeaTac Approach Control, asking if they had any traffic in that area. Negative. He tried to raise Michael again. "Cessna 42L, We have no radar contact with any other aircraft. Are you declaring an emergency? Silence. 10 seconds. 20 seconds. Then Michael's voice came back one final time, and what he said has been analyzed by investigators, aviation experts, and frankly, people like me who cannot accept the official explanation. He said, "Tower, the aircraft is signaling us to follow. Ryan says he wants to follow them. I need to," and then nothing. Dead air. The radio went silent. Michael's transponder signal disappeared from radar. The Cessna vanished as completely as if it had flown into another dimension. The tower operator declared an emergency immediately. Within minutes, the Coast Guard had helicopters in the air. Search and rescue teams mobilized. The Civil Air Patrol launched multiple aircraft. The search area covered hundreds of square miles over the Olympic Peninsula and the Strait of Juan de Fuca. They searched for 6 days straight. They found nothing. No wreckage, no debris, no emergency locator beacon signal. It was as if the Cessna and its 2 occupants had simply ceased to exist. The investigation was thorough and frustrating in equal measure. The FAA brought in their best accident investigators. They interviewed everyone who had contact with Michael that morning. They examined maintenance records for the Cessna. They analyzed weather data, radar recordings, radio transmissions. Every single piece of evidence pointed to the same impossible conclusion. Michael and his student had been flying a perfectly functional aircraft in perfect conditions when something unexplainable happened. The official report, when it finally came out 9 months later, was maddeningly vague. It stated that the aircraft had experienced an unexplained loss of contact and was presumed to have crashed into the heavily forested terrain of the Olympic Peninsula. Cause unknown. Contributing factors unknown. The case was classified as an unsolved aviation incident. My family was devastated. Michael's wife, Laura, was left without answers, without closure, without even a body to bury. 3 months after the disappearance, Laura held a memorial service. We all attended, trying to find some way to say goodbye when we had no idea what had actually happened. My father gave a eulogy about his brother's love of flying, his dedication to safety, his joy in teaching others. We told stories, we cried, we tried to move forward. But none of us could shake the feeling that something was profoundly wrong about the entire situation. And then 3 months after that, 6 months after he had disappeared, Michael walked out of the Olympic National Forest. A ranger found him on a trail near Lake Crescent, about 15 miles from his last known position. Michael was wearing the same clothes he had worn the day of the flight. His flight jacket, his jeans, his boots. He was not injured. He was not malnourished. He showed no signs of exposure, dehydration, or the effects of surviving 6 months in the wilderness. He looked exactly as he had the morning he had climbed into that Cessna, except for the expression on his face. Blank. Empty. Like someone had reached into his mind and scooped out everything that made him Michael. The ranger called it in, and within hours, Michael was transported to Olympic Medical Center in Port Angeles. My father and Laura were notified immediately. They rushed to the hospital, barely able to believe it was true. Michael was alive. Against all logic, against all odds, he was alive. But when they saw him, their relief turned to something else, something closer to horror. Michael could not remember anything, not the flight, not the disappearance, not the 6 months in between. Medical exams showed he was in perfect health. Perfect. His weight was exactly what it had been 6 months prior. His muscle mass unchanged, blood work completely normal. It was as if he had not experienced a single day of those missing months. As if time itself had just skipped forward for him while his body remained in stasis. Psychiatrists evaluated him. Neurologists ran every test they could think of. CAT scans, MRIs, psychological assessments. There was no brain damage, no signs of trauma, no indication of why he could not remember. One doctor suggested fugue state. Another proposed dissociative amnesia triggered by a traumatic event, but none of them could explain the physical impossibility of his condition. You could not survive 6 months in the Olympic wilderness without food and come out looking healthy and well-fed. Under hypnosis, which Laura insisted on despite the doctor's reservations, Michael began to describe fragments, not memories exactly, more like images, impressions. He spoke in a flat monotone about being shown things, about being taken to meet them, about seeing something he described as the map of everything. When the hypnotherapist asked him to elaborate, Michael became agitated. He said, "They wanted me to see. They wanted Ryan to see, but only Ryan was ready. Only Ryan could understand. I was just the way to get him there." And then Michael did something that made everyone in that session deeply uncomfortable. He took a piece of paper and drew a symbol. Complex, geometric, unlike anything in any known language or notation system. He drew it quickly, automatically, as if his hand was being guided. When he finished, he stared at it and said, "This is where we went. This is where Ryan still is." The hypnotherapist ended the session. Michael could not be hypnotized again. Every subsequent attempt failed. It was as if whatever had allowed that one breakthrough had closed permanently. But Michael kept that symbol. He drew it over and over on napkins, on scratch paper, on the margins of newspapers. Always the same, always perfect, always with that same blank expression. They found the student pilot's family and asked if Ryan had said anything unusual before the flight. His mother, devastated by her son's disappearance and now confused by Michael's return without him, said that Ryan had been having dreams, vivid dreams about flying, about meeting teachers in the sky, about learning things that humans were not supposed to know yet. She had thought they were just dreams, just the overactive imagination of a young man excited about learning to fly. Michael never flew again. The FAA revoked his instructor's license, not as punishment, but because he could not pass the psychological evaluation required to maintain it. He lives quietly now with Laura in Port Angeles. He works at a hardware store. He seems functional, normal to anyone who does not know his story. But those of us who knew him before can see the difference. The spark that made him Michael is gone. He's like a copy of himself, with all the details correct but something essential missing. I visit him sometimes. We sit on his porch overlooking the water, and I try to have a conversation like we used to, but his responses are hollow, polite but empty, until I mention the flight. Then something flickers in his eyes, something that might be memory, or might be something else entirely, and he says the same thing every time. They only needed one of us. Ryan was the one they wanted. I was just the driver, and they sent me back because my part was done. The wreckage of the Cessna has never been found. Ryan's body has never been recovered. The official stance is that Michael experienced a traumatic event that caused him to suppress his memories and somehow survive in the wilderness through a combination of luck and skills he cannot now recall. But I know that is not what happened. I know because Michael showed me something the doctors did not know about. When he came back, he had something in his flight jacket pocket, his logbook, the small notebook every pilot carries to record their flights. The last entry is dated March 8, 2006. It describes the flight, the takeoff, the climb to altitude. Michael's handwriting is clear and precise as always. But there is one more entry after that. Same date, but the handwriting is different. Still neat, still precise, but not Michael's writing. It says, flight concluded at 11:47 a.m. Destination reached. Passenger retained for further instruction. Pilot returned. Aircraft no longer needed. This exchange was voluntary and serves a purpose he will not remember, but that will become clear in time. He was not ready to see what we needed to show. The student was ready. The student will learn and eventually return with knowledge your species needs. This is a gift, though it will not feel like one. Michael let me photograph that entry. Then he tore the page out and burned it. He told me no one would believe it anyway, and he was probably right. But I have the photograph. I have the evidence. And I know that something took my Uncle Michael and his student up into the sky over the Olympic Peninsula on a clear March morning in 2006. Something that could make itself invisible to radar. Something that could evaluate whether a person was ready for whatever it wanted to show them. Something that kept Michael for 6 months without letting time touch him, then sent him back as a hollow messenger with a symbol burned into his memory, and a logbook entry that suggests this has happened before and will happen again. My Uncle Michael disappeared, and the man who came back wears his face and carries his name. But somewhere, over the forests of the Olympic Peninsula, the real Michael is still gone, still flying formation with something we are not meant to understand yet. I moved to Seattle in the spring of 2015, fresh out of college with a job offer at a tech startup and absolutely no idea how brutal the rental market in that city actually was. After 3 weeks of looking at overpriced apartments that were either the size of closets or required me to have 6 roommates I had never met, I finally found something promising. A basement apartment in Capitol Hill, 1 bedroom, utilities included, and most importantly, within my budget. The landlord was a woman in her 60s named Mrs. Chen, who owned the house and lived on the upper floors. She seemed nice enough during the showing, a bit nervous maybe, but I chalk that up to the standard anxiety of renting to someone fresh out of college. The apartment itself was exactly what I needed. Clean, recently painted, with a small kitchen and bathroom. The only entrance was a side door that led down a short flight of stairs, giving me privacy from the main house. Mrs. Chen explained that the previous tenant had left about 2 months prior, rather suddenly, and had left behind a few items in storage. She said I could use the storage closet in the corner of the main room once she cleared out the previous tenant's things. I did not think much of it at the time. People leave stuff behind when they move. It happens. I signed the lease that afternoon and moved in the following weekend. The first few days were normal. I unpacked, set up my furniture, started my new job. The neighborhood was great, walkable to coffee shops and restaurants, exactly the Seattle experience I had hoped for. But I started noticing small things that seemed off. The storage closet Mrs. Chen had mentioned was still locked. When I asked her about it, she said she was still trying to contact the previous tenant, a woman named Olivia, to arrange pickup of her belongings. Fair enough, except that 2 months had already passed. Then there was the smell. Faint at first, coming from the general direction of the storage closet. Not quite decay, but organic and unpleasant. Old food maybe, or mold. I mentioned it to Mrs. Chen during her next visit to collect rent. She noticed it too, and her face went pale. She promised to deal with the storage closet that week, to clear everything out whether she could reach Olivia or not. But what really started to bother me were the sounds. Late at night, when the house should have been completely quiet, I would hear movement from inside the sealed storage closet. Scratching sounds. Shifting. Like something was being rearranged. I convinced myself it was rats or some other vermin that had gotten into the walls, but the sounds had a rhythm that seemed too deliberate, too purposeful. One night around 2 in the morning, I was jerked awake by a loud crash from the closet. Something heavy had fallen or been knocked over. I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and approached the closet door. It was still locked from the outside, old padlock that Mrs. Chen had the only key for. But the sounds continued, shuffling, dragging. And then, clear as day, I heard something that made my blood run cold. Breathing. Heavy, labored breathing coming from behind that locked door. I called Mrs. Chen immediately, not caring that it was the middle of the night. She answered on the 5th ring, groggy but alert when she heard the panic in my voice. I explained what I was hearing. There was a long pause on her end. Then she said something I will never forget. "Do not open that door. Do not go near it. I'm calling the police right now." She hung up before I could ask why. I stood there in my apartment, listening to those sounds continue for another 10 minutes until they finally stopped. The police arrived 20 minutes later, 2 officers who seemed confused about the nature of the call. Mrs. Chen met them at my door, and she looked terrified, actually shaking. She told them she needed to open the storage closet, that there might be something dangerous inside, and that she wanted them present when she did. One of the officers asked if she thought someone was in there. Mrs. Chen said no, but that she needed to check something. Her hands were trembling so badly, she could barely get the key into the padlock. When it finally opened and she pulled the door wide, I saw what had been hidden in my apartment for the 2 months I had been living there. The closet was not storage. It was a shrine. The walls were covered floor to ceiling with photographs, dozens of them, maybe 100, all of different women. Some were candid shots taken from a distance. Women walking down the street, sitting in coffee shops, shopping in stores. Others were closer, more intimate, clearly taken without the subject's knowledge, through windows, in parking garages at bus stops. And surrounding the photos were notes, handwritten observations, schedules, routines, where each woman lived, where she worked, what time she left her house in the morning. But it got worse. In the center of the closet, arranged on a small table, was a collection of items, personal items, a driver's license, credit cards with different names, keys, a phone, jewelry, things that could only have been taken directly from the women in the photographs. And next to these items was a notebook, spiral-bound, filled with pages and pages of handwriting. The police officers went from confused to deadly serious in about 3 seconds. They cleared Mrs. Chen and me out of the apartment, called for backup, and treated the entire place as a crime scene. Within an hour, there were detectives, crime scene investigators, evidence technicians. My little basement apartment became the center of a major investigation. What they found in that notebook was horrifying. Olivia, the previous tenant, had been stalking multiple women throughout Capitol Hill and the surrounding neighborhoods. The notebook contained what investigators later described as murder plans. Detailed fantasies about abducting, torturing, and killing these women. Specific methods, timelines, locations where she planned to take them. Some entries described practice runs, where she had broken into the women's homes while they were away, moved items around, left signs that someone had been there. Psychological torture before the physical kind. The most disturbing part was how organized it all was. This was not the random obsession of someone spiraling out of control. This was methodical, calculated. Olivia had been building toward something, and based on the dates in her notebook, she had been doing this for at least 2 years before Mrs. Chen rented her the apartment. The storage closet had been her planning room, her sanctuary, where she refined her fantasies into actionable plans. Detectives identified 13 of the women from the photographs. They contacted all of them. 5 had filed harassment reports or restraining orders against someone matching Olivia's description, but had not been able to identify her definitively because she was careful about being seen. 3 others had experienced break-ins where nothing was stolen, but they knew someone had been in their homes. One woman broke down when detectives showed her the photos. She had been feeling watched for months, had changed her routines, installed cameras, but could never catch whoever was following her. But here is the truly terrifying part. Olivia was never found. When Mrs. Chen had rented her the apartment 2.5 years earlier, Olivia had provided references, passed a background check, seemed like a normal professional woman. She worked remotely as a web designer, kept to herself, paid rent on time. Mrs. Chen had noticed nothing unusual until Olivia suddenly moved out in the middle of the night 2 months before I moved in, leaving the storage closet locked and taking only her personal belongings from the main living space. The address Olivia had provided as her previous residence did not exist. Her references were fake. Her background check had somehow been falsified or run under a stolen identity. The name Olivia Chen that appeared on the lease application matched 3 different women in Washington state, none of whom were her. Facial recognition software could not identify her from the few photos Mrs. Chen had, which were blurry, and somehow always showed Olivia from angles that obscured her features. Police believe she knew she was about to escalate from stalking to actual violence, and that something spooked her. Maybe one of her victims noticed something. Maybe she had a close call. Whatever it was, she abandoned her shrine and vanished completely. Detectives checked every lead: security footage from nearby businesses, transit records, hotel registries, nothing. It was like she evaporated. The woman who had lived in that apartment before Olivia came forward after seeing the news coverage. She said she had moved out early because she felt uncomfortable, like someone was watching her sleep. She would wake up in the night with the overwhelming sensation of someone standing over her bed. She found strands of hair that were not hers on her pillow. Her things would be moved slightly, just enough to notice. When she mentioned it to Mrs. Chen, they both assumed it was stress or maybe sleepwalking. But now it made horrible sense. Olivia had not been living there. She had been studying whoever lived in that space, testing her skills, refining her methods. I moved out 3 days later. Mrs. Chen did not even try to hold me to the lease. She was devastated, horrified that she had unknowingly provided a base of operations for someone who was planning to murder women. She sold the house 6 months later and moved to California to live with her daughter. I do not blame her. How do you live in a place where you know that level of evil was germinating right beneath your feet? But the story does not end there. I still live in Seattle. Different neighborhood, different apartment, much more careful about security now. About 6 months after the discovery of Olivia's shrine, I was riding the bus home from work. Rush hour, crowded, people packed in tight. And I saw her. Or I think I did. A woman standing near the back doors. Average height, dark hair, completely unremarkable except for the way she was staring at a young woman sitting near the window. Not just looking, studying. The same focused intensity you see in predators at the zoo watching prey animals. Our eyes met for just a second, and she smiled. Not a friendly smile. A knowing smile. A smile that said she recognized me, knew exactly who I was and what I had found in that basement apartment. Then the bus stopped, the doors opened, and she got off. I tried to follow, but the crowd was too thick. By the time I reached the street, she had disappeared into the flow of pedestrians. I reported it to the detective handling the case. He took my statement seriously, reviewed transit camera footage from that bus. They found her on video for exactly 7 seconds before she exited. Not enough for facial recognition, not enough to track where she went. Just enough to confirm that yes, someone matching the description had been there. Watching, hunting. The detective told me something off the record after he reviewed the footage. 5 more women in the Seattle area had reported similar experiences over the past months. Feeling watched, finding evidence someone had been in their homes. One had discovered photos of herself on her own phone that she had not taken. Selfies from angles that suggested someone else had briefly had possession of her phone and returned it without her noticing. The detective believed Olivia was still in the city. Still stalking, still building toward whatever she had been planning. And here is what keeps me awake at night. That notebook they found had a section at the end titled, "The Ones Who Got Away." It listed women who had noticed her surveillance too quickly, who had moved or changed routines or taken security measures that made them too difficult to continue stalking. There were 12 names on that list. The last entry, dated 3 days before Olivia disappeared from the apartment, read, "Too aware now. All of them too careful. Time to find fresh hunting grounds. Time to find women who do not know to be afraid yet." Olivia is out there somewhere, maybe still in Seattle, maybe in Portland or Vancouver or some other Pacific Northwest city, building a new shrine, filling a new notebook with observations and plans, getting closer to the moment when stalking turns into something much worse. And 13 women who were photographed and studied and hunted, Know that somewhere, in some locked room, their faces are still pinned to a wall in someone's mind, if not on paper. That somewhere, a woman named Olivia, or whatever she calls herself now, is still watching and waiting and planning. I install deadbolts on all my doors. I vary my routines. I check behind me when I walk home at night, but I know that determined predators can be patient. And I know that the woman I saw on that bus was sending me a message. She knows where I am. She could find me if she wanted to, and the only question is whether I am interesting enough prey, or if she has already moved on to someone else, someone who has no idea they are being watched right now. My grandfather David worked for 43 years in the lumber industry in the Pacific Northwest. He started as a green chain puller right out of high school in 1955 and worked his way up to shift supervisor at Fairhaven Mill in Bellingham, Washington. He was the kind of man who never missed a day of work, who took pride in his job, who believed that honest labor was the foundation of a good life. He loved that mill. He loved the smell of fresh-cut timber, the sound of the saws, the satisfaction of turning raw logs into lumber that would build homes and businesses. When the mill shut down in 1998 due to declining demand and cheaper imports, it broke his heart. But he found new work as a night security guard for the property management company that owned the building. It was not the same, he told me, but at least he could still walk those familiar halls and remember better days. The mill sat empty for 8 years. The machinery was left in place because the cost of removing it was more than anyone wanted to pay. The building was massive, over 200,000 square feet of space filled with conveyor belts, saws, sorting equipment, and the ghosts of decades of hard work. David's job was simple: walk the perimeter twice a night, check the locks, make sure no vandals or copper thieves were trying to break in. It was quiet, solitary work, and he actually enjoyed it. He would walk those dark halls with his flashlight, remembering the men he had worked alongside. Many of them now passed on, and he felt like he was keeping watch over something important. Then, in early 2006, the property management company sold the mill to a developer who planned to demolish it and build condominiums. David was told he had 3 more weeks of work. Then the building would be torn down and his services would no longer be needed. He was 69 years old by then, ready to retire anyway. So he was not upset, but he was sad. The mill had been his life, and watching it get torn down felt like watching a piece of himself disappear. His last scheduled shift was on a Friday night in March. He arrived at 10 p.m. as usual, unlocked the main entrance, and began his rounds. The demolition was scheduled to start the following Monday, so this was truly the last time he would walk through the mill. He told my grandmother before he left that he wanted to say a proper goodbye, to thank the building for all the years it had given him. The first round was uneventful. David walked the perimeter, checked the doors, made sure everything was secure. The building was silent except for the normal sounds of an old structure settling, the creaking of timber, the scurry of rats in the walls. He made his notes in his security log, sat down in the small office near the main entrance, and ate the sandwich my grandmother had packed for him. It was during his second round, around 2:30 in the morning, that he heard something that should not have been possible. Machinery running. Not just one piece of equipment, but multiple machines. The distinctive whine of saw blades spinning, the rumble of conveyor belts moving, the hydraulic hiss of log lifts operating. David froze in the hallway, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The sounds were coming from the main cutting room, the heart of the mill where the largest equipment was located. But there was no power connected to the building. It had been shut off 2 months prior as part of the pre-demolition process. There was no way any of that machinery could be running. David's first thought was that someone had broken in and somehow brought in a generator, maybe thieves trying to steal equipment before the demolition. He radioed his supervisor, reported the situation, and was told to investigate, but not to confront anyone. Police were on the way. David approached the cutting room carefully. The sounds grew louder as he got closer. Not just machinery now, but voices. Men shouting over the noise, communicating the way crews used to during active shifts. He pushed open the heavy doors to the cutting room, and his flashlight revealed something that made him question his own sanity. The cutting room was fully operational. Every piece of equipment was running. Saw blades spinning at full speed, conveyor belts carrying invisible loads, hydraulic lifts moving up and down. But more than that, the room was full of men. 30 or 40 workers, all wearing the canvas work clothes and leather gloves from decades past, all performing their tasks with the practiced efficiency of experienced mill workers. David recognized some of them, men he had worked alongside in the 50s and 60s and 70s, men who had been dead for years. He saw Tommy Larson feeding logs into the primary saw. Tommy had died in 1984 of a heart attack. He saw Richard Nakamura operating the planer. Richard had been killed in a car accident in 1991. He saw his old supervisor, Frank Morrison, directing the flow of work from the control platform. Frank had been dead since 1996, lung cancer from a lifetime of smoking. David stood frozen in the doorway, unable to process what he was seeing. The men worked with the same rhythm and coordination they had possessed in life, calling out measurements, adjusting equipment, working together like the well-oiled crew they had once been. None of them seemed to notice David standing there. They were completely focused on their work, on processing timber that was not there, on producing lumber for a demand that no longer existed. And then David saw what they were building toward. In the far corner of the room, a log was moving down the main conveyor belt toward the primary saw. But this log was wrong. It was not wood. David's mind refused to accept what his eyes were showing him, but there was no mistaking it. The shape on the conveyor belt was a man. A living man, screaming silently, his mouth open in terror, his hands bound. David recognized him too. Billy Henderson. Young kid, maybe 22 years old, had been working at the mill for less than a year when it happened. May 12th, 1952. David remembered the date because it was burned into the memory of everyone who had been there. Billy had been feeding logs into the primary saw when his sleeve got caught in the conveyor belt. It pulled him in. The safety mechanisms failed. The saw was moving too fast. By the time someone hit the emergency stop, it was too late. Billy Henderson had been pulled through the primary saw and killed in one of the most gruesome accidents in the mill's history. And now, David was watching it happen again. The phantom crew, the ghost workers from decades of mill operations, were replaying that terrible day. Billy's shape moved down the conveyor belt toward the spinning saw blade. The men around the room continued their work, unaware or unable to stop what was coming. David wanted to scream, wanted to run forward and stop it, but his body would not move. He could only watch as history repeated itself in spectral form. The saw blade caught Billy. The sound was horrific. Worse than any nightmare, the scream of steel, meeting resistance it was never meant to cut. And in that moment, every man in the room stopped working and turned to look at David. Not at the accident, at him. Their faces were expressionless, their eyes hollow, but David felt the weight of their attention like a physical force. Frank Morrison, the old supervisor, raised his hand and pointed directly at David. His mouth moved, forming words that David could not hear over the machinery, but David could read lips. Frank was saying, "This is the price. This is what we paid. Every beam, every board, every house built from this mill was paid for in blood. 17 men died here. 17 souls fed to the machines. And you all forgot. You all moved on. But we are still here. We are still working. We are still paying." David ran. He turned and fled from that cutting room, his heart hammering, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He heard the machinery shut down behind him, heard the silence return like a heavy blanket falling over the building. He made it to the main entrance, burst through the doors into the cool night air, and collapsed on the gravel parking lot. That is where the police found him 10 minutes later, sitting in the gravel, shaking, unable to speak coherently. The officers investigated. They found the cutting room exactly as it should be. Silent, dark, machinery cold and still. No signs that anything had been running. No footprints in the decades of dust that covered the floor. No evidence that anyone had been in there at all. They wrote it off as an elderly security guard falling asleep and having a nightmare. They suggested that David might be experiencing early dementia, that the stress of the building's upcoming demolition had triggered some kind of episode. David quit that night, after 30 years of never missing a shift, of perfect reliability. He turned in his keys and his security badge and said he would never set foot in that building again. The property management company tried to convince him to finish his last 2 weeks, but David refused. He told them they could keep his final paycheck. He wanted nothing more from that place. He came to our house the next morning. I was 15 years old at the time, sitting at the breakfast table when he arrived. My grandmother made him coffee and he sat there for 2 hours, telling us what he had seen. My parents exchanged concerned looks, clearly thinking the same thing the police had, that David was having some kind of breakdown. But I believed him. I could see in his eyes that what he had witnessed was real, at least to him. And I had heard the stories about Fairhaven Mill, about the accidents, about the men who had died there over the decades of operation. I asked him the question that no one else wanted to ask. "Grandpa, how many men died at that mill? You said Frank told you 17. David nodded slowly. I could only remember 14 for certain, but Frank would know. Frank supervised that mill for 28 years. He would know every man who died there. Over the next week, I went to the library and researched. Old newspaper articles on microfiche, historical records from the county, obituaries. I found documentation of 14 workplace fatalities at Fairhaven Mill between 1947 and 1998, but I also found 3 more that were less clear. A worker named Jose Ramirez, who disappeared from his shift in 1963 and whose body was found in the woods 6 miles from the mill 2 months later. Official cause of death was exposure, but his co-workers had told police they thought he had been injured at work and tried to walk out rather than report it. A maintenance worker named Charles Whitmore, who died of a heart attack on site in 1971, but whose widow had always maintained he had been electrocuted by faulty equipment, and the company covered it up to avoid liability. And a night watchman named Robert Chen, who died in 1989 when part of the mill's roof collapsed during his shift, an accident that some suspected was due to deferred maintenance the company had ignored. 17 deaths. Frank had been right. 17 men had died at Fairhaven Mill, their lives fed into the machinery of industry and profit. And according to my grandfather David, they were still there, still working their shifts, still paying the price for every board that left that mill. The demolition was delayed, not because of David's story, but because they discovered asbestos that had not been properly documented. The remediation took 3 months. During that time, the night security company rotated through 4 different guards assigned to the mill. Every single one of them requested reassignment after 1 or 2 shifts. They all reported the same things. The sound of machinery running when no power was connected, the smell of fresh sawdust, the sensation of being watched by dozens of unseen eyes. One guard captured audio on his phone. When investigators analyzed it, they identified the distinct sounds of industrial sawmill equipment in operation, despite the building having no power. The mill was finally demolished in July of 2006. It took 2 weeks of round-the-clock work to bring down the structure and remove the debris. The demolition crew reported numerous equipment failures, unexplained malfunctions, and an atmosphere that made experienced workers uncomfortable. One operator swore he saw figures moving through the building as his excavator tore through the walls, men in old-fashioned work clothes disappearing into the rubble. The condominium development that was supposed to be built on the site never materialized. The developer backed out, citing economic concerns. though rumors persisted that they had encountered problems with the land itself. Strange sounds coming from the ground. Equipment operators reporting that the soil felt wrong somehow, resisted in ways that made no engineering sense. Today, the lot sits empty. It has been 19 years since the demolition. The property has been sold 4 times, but no one has ever broken ground on new construction. The city uses it for overflow parking now. People who park there regularly report unusual experiences. Car alarms going off simultaneously in the middle of the night. The smell of sawdust when none should be present. And on foggy nights, some claim they can hear it. The distant sound of machinery running, of men shouting orders, of a mill that refuses to accept that its work is finished. My grandfather David died in 2014 at the age of 77. He never spoke about that night again after telling us his story that morning. But in the last weeks of his life, when the cancer had taken most of his strength, he said something to me that I will never forget. He said, "I used to think that mill was the best years of my life. Good honest work, good men working beside me. But now I know the truth. That place took pieces of all of us. Some men it took all at once, killed them in accidents. Others it took slowly, wearing us down year by year. And when we died, it kept those pieces. It is still keeping them. The mill is gone, but the debt is not paid. 17 men gave everything to that place, and it will not let them rest until someone acknowledges what they lost." I visited the empty lot last month, stood there in the parking area where a massive lumber mill once hummed with industry and life. The rain was coming down the way it does in Bellingham, steady and cold, and I said the names out loud, all 17 of them. Every man who died at Fairhaven Mill. I do not know if ghosts are real. I do not know if my grandfather really saw what he claimed to see that night, but I know that those men lived and worked and died in service of an industry that moved on without them. The least I could do was remember their names. The lot was quiet as I spoke, just rain and wind and the distant sound of traffic. But when I finished and turned to leave, I heard it. Just for a moment. Just long enough to make me stop and look back. The sound of a saw blade spinning up to speed, and then silence again. My sister Sophia was always the adventurous one in our family. While I was perfectly content with hiking marked trails and camping in developed campgrounds, Sophia wanted to go places where most people never ventured. She took up spelunking when she was 23, joining a caving club in Eugene, Oregon, where she was working on her graduate degree in geology. She loved the challenge of navigating underground systems, the thrill of discovering chambers that maybe only a handful of people had ever seen. Our parents worried constantly, but Sophia always assured them she followed safety protocols, never went alone, always told someone her plans. She was careful and experienced, which is why what happened in the fall of 2013 was so completely unexpected and, frankly, terrifying. Oregon has thousands of caves. Some are well-known tourist attractions like the Oregon Caves National Monument. Others are documented but restricted to experienced cavers with permits. And then there are the unmapped ones, cave systems that exist in the vast wilderness areas where no comprehensive geological surveys have been conducted. Sophia's caving group was always hoping to find one of these unmapped systems, to be the first to explore and document a new discovery. In October of 2013, heavy rains triggered a landslide on the eastern slope of the Cascade Range, about 30 miles from Crater Lake. A group of hikers reported seeing what looked like a new cave entrance that had been exposed by the slide. They posted about it on a local outdoors forum, and Sophia's caving group saw the post within hours. 5 of them decided to do a preliminary exploration that weekend. Sophia, her boyfriend Derek, and 3 other club members packed their gear and drove out to the coordinates the hikers had provided. They found the entrance exactly where it was supposed to be. A gap in the rock face, about 4 feet wide and 6 feet tall, revealed when hundreds of tons of earth and debris had slid away. Derek set up their safety rope system, while Sophia documented the entrance with photographs and GPS coordinates. They had agreed beforehand that this would be a shallow exploration only, just enough to determine if the cave system was worth a more thorough expedition later. The cave entrance led down at a steep angle, requiring them to use ropes for the first 30 feet. But once they got past that initial descent, the passage opened into a tunnel about 8 feet in diameter, tall enough to walk upright. The rock formations were unusual, Sophia noted, not the typical basalt or limestone she was used to seeing in Oregon caves. The walls had a strange crystalline quality, almost like they were embedded with mineral deposits that caught their headlamp beams and reflected the light in odd patterns. They followed the main tunnel for about 200 feet. It branched several times, but they marked their route carefully with reflective tags, standard caving practice to ensure they could find their way back out. The air was cool but not cold, and surprisingly fresh for a cave system this deep. Usually, Sophia said, you could feel the air quality change as you went deeper, becoming stale or sometimes filling with carbon dioxide in poorly ventilated systems. But this cave had airflow, which suggested it connected to the surface somewhere else. After about 40 minutes of exploration, they reached a chamber. It was roughly circular, maybe 50 feet in diameter, with a ceiling that rose at least 30 feet above them. And this is where things stopped making sense. The walls of the chamber were covered in symbols, not natural formations, not random scratches from animals or water erosion. Deliberate carvings arranged in patterns that suggested language or mathematics or some kind of notation system that none of them recognized. Sophia had studied geology and anthropology. She had seen petroglyphs from Native American sites, had visited archaeological locations throughout the Pacific Northwest. These symbols were different, more precise, more complex. Geometric patterns that seemed to follow mathematical principles, but not any system she was familiar with. Derek suggested they might be modern, that someone had found this cave before them and carved graffiti, but the symbols had the same weathering and patina as the surrounding rock. They were old, very old. The group spent 20 minutes photographing everything. Sophia used her high-resolution camera to capture detailed images of each section of the wall. She measured the dimensions of the chamber, took samples of the unusual crystalline formations for later analysis. One of the other cavers, a chemistry teacher named Amanda, pointed out that the crystal formations should not exist geologically in this type of rock at this elevation. The mineral composition was wrong for the region. They decided to push deeper, just to see if the cave system continued. The chamber had 3 exits, tunnels leading off in different directions. They chose the largest one, which sloped downward at a gentle grade. This tunnel was different from the entrance passage. The walls were smoother, almost machined. The crystalline deposits were more concentrated here, forming veins that ran along the ceiling in patterns that reminded Sophia of circuit boards. About 100 feet down this tunnel, they found evidence that changed everything. Modern equipment. Not ancient, not historical. Recent. Sophia's headlamp beam caught something metallic propped against the wall. She approached carefully and found a geological survey case, the kind used by professional field teams. It was stamped with official government markings. Department of the Interior, United States Geological Survey. Date stamped 2011. The case was not locked. Inside were core samples, carefully labeled and stored. Notebooks filled with technical data and observations, and maps, detailed maps of a cave system that extended for miles underground, showing chambers and passages that suggested this discovery was far more significant than an ordinary cave. The notes included phrases that made no sense in a standard geological context. References to anomalous mineral structures, non-terrestrial composition, and recommend immediate containment and classification. Sophia photographed everything, the equipment, the notes, the maps. Derek was getting nervous now, suggesting they should leave. If this was an active government research site, They could be in serious trouble for being there without authorization. But Sophia wanted to see more. The map showed a large chamber about 300 feet further down the tunnel, labeled on the map only as Primary Site, Level 4 clearance required. They heard it before they saw it. A sound coming from deep below them, rhythmic and mechanical, like generators running or ventilation systems operating. The cave was not abandoned. Someone was down here right now doing something that required power and equipment. Sophia knew they needed to leave immediately, but curiosity drove her forward just far enough to see around a bend in the tunnel. What she saw made her grab Derek's arm so hard she left bruises. The tunnel opened into another chamber, this one lit with artificial light. Portable work lights on stands, running off cables that disappeared deeper into the cave system. And in the center of the chamber was equipment, drilling rigs, computer stations, some kind of containment apparatus built around a section of the wall, and men in hazmat suits, working with the same focused intensity you would see at a biological research facility. One of the men turned and saw Sophia's headlamp beam. He shouted something she could not make out, and suddenly all 5 members of her caving group were running back the way they had come. They scrambled up that tunnel faster than any of them thought possible, grabbed their ropes, hauled themselves up the steep entrance passage, and emerged into the forest, gasping for breath. They drove back to Eugene in shocked silence. Sophia had her camera, had the photographs, had documentation of everything they had seen. She planned to research what she had found, maybe contact the USGS, and ask what kind of operation they were running in that cave, but she never got the chance. The next morning, she woke to a knock on her apartment door. 2 federal agents, FBI credentials, asking very politely if they could come inside and speak with her about a cave exploration she had conducted the previous day. Sophia's blood ran cold. How did they know? How had they found her so fast? The agents were professional but firm. They explained that she and her group had entered a restricted area, that the cave system was part of an ongoing federal investigation and was classified. They needed to confiscate any photographs, any samples, any documentation she had collected. It was not optional. It was a matter of national security, Sophia argued. She wanted to know why. What was in that cave that required federal classification? What were they researching down there? The agents would not say. They simply repeated that she needed to hand over all materials related to the cave exploration. When she hesitated, one of them made it very clear that failure to comply would result in charges under laws she did not even know existed. She gave them her camera, her notes, her GPS unit. They took everything. Then they asked her to sign a non-disclosure agreement. Multiple pages of dense legal language that basically stated she could never discuss the cave location, what she had seen, or the existence of any federal operation in that area. If she violated the NDA, she would face criminal prosecution and civil penalties that would bankrupt her for life. Sophia signed. What choice did she have? But before the agents left, she asked one final question. What is in that cave? What did we find? One of the agents, the older one who had done most of the talking, looked at her for a long moment. Then he said something that has haunted Sophia ever since. There are places in the Pacific Northwest where the geology is not just old, it is other. We have protocols for this. We have been managing these sites for longer than you have been alive. You were never in danger, but you saw things that raise questions we are not prepared to answer publicly. Go back to your studies. Forget about this cave. And understand that some discoveries are classified not because they are dangerous, but because the public is not ready to know what they imply. The cave entrance was sealed within a week. Sophia hiked back out there with Derek to see for herself. The entire area had been filled with concrete, disguised to look like natural rock. You would never know there had been an entrance there unless you had seen it before. Posted nearby were signs declaring the area restricted due to geological instability. The The coordinates disappeared from the hiking form where they had originally been posted. Sophia finished her geology degree and now works as an environmental consultant in Portland. She has never been spelunking again, but she kept one thing the agents did not know about: a small crystal sample she had broken off in that first chamber and slipped into her jacket pocket. She had it analyzed by a private lab, paying cash and not using her real name. The results came back impossible. The mineral composition did not match anything in standard geological databases. The crystalline structure suggested formation under conditions that do not exist naturally on Earth. Sophia still has that sample. She keeps it in a safe deposit box, and she has the coordinates memorized, though they would do her no good now. But what disturbs her most is not what she saw or what was taken from her. It is what the agent said, that there are other sites, plural, that they have protocols and management systems, that this has been going on for decades. How many caves in the Pacific Northwest are sealed and classified? How many contain things that raise questions we are not ready to answer? And what exactly is down there, deep in the geology of the region, that requires federal agents in hazmat suits and non-disclosure agreements to keep secret? Sophia does not have answers, but she thinks about that cave every single day, about those symbols on the walls, about that equipment, and those men in hazmat suits working on something they will never acknowledge exists. And she wonders what they are so afraid the public will learn. My neighbor William is the kind of person who minds his own business. He has lived in the same apartment building in Vancouver, Washington for 15 years, keeps to himself, goes to work at the post office every morning at 6, comes home every evening at 4, watches his television at a reasonable volume, and never causes problems. He is polite when we pass in the hallway, but we are not friends exactly, just neighbors who coexist peacefully in the same building. Which is why when he knocked on my door at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday in April 2017, looking pale and shaking, I knew something was seriously wrong. The apartment building where we live is old, built in the 1970s, 3 stories with thin walls and thinner floors. You can hear your neighbors walking around, hear their televisions if they turn them up too loud, hear arguments and parties, and all the normal sounds of people living in close proximity. William's apartment is directly below a 2-bedroom unit on the 3rd floor. For years, that unit had been occupied by a quiet older woman who eventually moved to assisted living. The apartment sat vacant for 2 months before new tenants moved in last February. William told me he first met them on moving day. A couple, probably in their 30s, friendly enough. The man introduced himself as Marcus, the woman as Jennifer. They made small talk about the building, about the neighborhood, normal new neighbor conversation. William helped them carry a few boxes up the stairs, and they thanked him. Nothing unusual, nothing that raised any red flags. The first few weeks were normal. William would hear them moving around upstairs, the occasional sound of conversation or television. But after about a month, he started noticing patterns that seemed odd. The couple never left during the day. Never. William worked varied shifts at the post office, sometimes early morning, sometimes afternoons, sometimes split shifts. No matter what time he was home during daylight hours, Marcus and Jennifer were home too. He would hear them moving around up there, hear conversations, hear the television, but he never saw them leave. They only went out at night. William would be watching television or getting ready for bed, and he would hear their door open and close around 9 or 10 p.m. He would hear them coming back hours later, sometimes as late as 3 or 4 in the morning. And when they came back, there were always sounds of dragging heavy items being moved across the floor above his bedroom. William tried to rationalize it. Maybe they worked night shifts. Maybe they were just night owls who preferred to do their shopping and errands after dark. It was unusual, but not necessarily suspicious, except that whenever he did see them in the hallways or parking lot, they seemed nervous, jumpy. Marcus especially would scan the area constantly, like he was watching for someone. and they always carried large bags or duffel bags, bulky items wrapped in blankets. Then there was the smell. It started in mid-March, a chemical odor that would waft down through the vents and floor. Not quite bleach, not quite ammonia, but something harsh and astringent. William mentioned it to the building manager, who said she would look into it, but nothing came of it. The smell would come and go, usually strongest in the early morning hours, right after William would hear Marcus and Jennifer return from their night outings. What finally pushed William to pay attention was the sound. Not the normal walking around or moving furniture, this was different. One night around 1 a.m., William woke to the sound of crying coming through his ceiling. Not angry crying or sad crying, distressed crying, the kind of sound that speaks of fear and pain. A woman's voice, but not Jennifer's voice. This voice was younger, and she was pleading. William could not make out words, just the tone, pleading, begging, desperate. The crying lasted for maybe 10 minutes, then stopped abruptly. Too abruptly. William lay in his bed, heart pounding, trying to decide what to do. Maybe it was a television show. Maybe they were watching a movie. But the sound had been too real, too immediate, and it had come from directly above him, from the living area of the apartment, not from where a television would normally be positioned. He tried to go back to sleep but could not. For the rest of the night, he heard movement upstairs, dragging sounds, water running for extended periods, that chemical smell getting stronger. When morning came, William heard Marcus and Jennifer leave at their usual time, around 10 a.m. He waited 30 minutes, then went upstairs and knocked on their door, planning to ask casually if everything was okay. No answer. He knocked again. Nothing. William went back to his apartment and tried to convince himself he was overreacting, but he could not shake the memory of that crying, that pleading tone. He decided to do something he had never done before. He started paying attention, really paying attention to Marcus and Jennifer's patterns. Over the next week, he kept notes, times they left, times they returned, what they carried with them. The bags they brought in were always heavy, carried carefully. The bags they took out were lighter, wrapped in plastic. They never spoke to other residents. They never had visitors. Mail for the apartment sat uncollected in the lobby mailboxes for days at a time. And twice more, William heard sounds through the ceiling that made his skin crawl. Once, a thud like something heavy dropping. Once, that crying again, followed by harsh voices telling someone to shut up. William called the police non-emergency line on April 15th. He explained his concerns, that he believed something was wrong in the apartment above him. The operator took his information and said they would send an officer to do a welfare check. William waited, watching from his window. The police arrived about 40 minutes later, 2 officers, and went up to the 3rd floor. William heard them knock, heard them identify themselves. No answer. The officers left after about 10 minutes. One of them stopped by William's door to let him know they had knocked, but no one was home. There was no probable cause to enter the apartment, and unless he had evidence of an actual crime being committed, there was nothing more they could do. William felt frustrated and helpless. He knew something was wrong, but what could he prove? Strange hours and chemical smells were not crimes. 2 nights later, William woke to the most disturbing sound yet. Not crying this time, screaming. Muffled but unmistakable, a woman screaming in pure terror, and underneath it the sound of a struggle. Furniture crashing, heavy impacts, voices shouting. William grabbed his phone and called 911 immediately. He told the operator there was a violent assault happening in the apartment above him, gave the address and apartment number, and begged them to hurry. The police arrived within 5 minutes, 4 officers this time. William met them in the lobby and directed them to the 3rd floor. He could still hear sounds coming from the apartment. The officers pounded on the door, identified themselves, demanded entry. When no one answered, they forced the door open, standard procedure when there is an immediate threat to life. What they found inside that apartment made hardened police officers call for backup and additional detectives. William watched from his doorway as more police arrived, as the building was evacuated, as the couple was brought out in handcuffs. Marcus looked calm, almost smug. Jennifer was crying, but they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of anger at being caught. The police would not tell residents many details that night, but over the following days and weeks, the story came out through news coverage and eventually the trial. Marcus and Jennifer were not a couple in the traditional sense. They were partners in a human trafficking operation. The apartment had been modified with soundproofing in one bedroom, locks on the outside of the door, restraints anchored to the walls. They had been holding 3 women captive, women they had lured with promises of jobs or housing, women they planned to transport and sell to buyers in other states. The chemical smell William had noticed was industrial cleaner, used to remove evidence. The heavy bags they carried in contained supplies, food for their captives, equipment for restraint. The bags they carried out contained clothing and personal items from the women, disposed of to eliminate identification. The sounds William heard were real. The crying was real. The screaming was real. 3 women had been imprisoned in that apartment above William's head for weeks, and he had been hearing their suffering through his ceiling. The 3 women were rescued and taken to secure facilities where they could receive medical care and support. They were traumatized but alive, thanks to William making that final call. The investigation revealed that Marcus and Jennifer were part of a larger trafficking network operating along the I-5 corridor from Seattle to Portland. They had done this before in other cities, other apartment buildings, always choosing units where they could operate with relative privacy. The trial was in 2018. William testified about what he had heard, about his attempts to get help, about the months of suspicious activity. Marcus and Jennifer were convicted on multiple counts of human trafficking, kidnapping, and assault. They received sentences of 40 and 35 years, respectively. The 3 women they had held captive also testified, describing in horrific detail the weeks they spent locked in that apartment, hearing the normal sounds of life continuing around them through the walls, unable to call for help. One of the women, a 19-year-old named Sarah who had responded to a fake job posting, said something during her victim impact statement that has stayed with William ever since. She said that she had heard him through the floor, heard his television, heard him walking around, heard the normal sounds of someone living their life just below where she was imprisoned. She said she used to pray that he would somehow know, somehow sense that something was wrong and get help, and he did. His willingness to trust his instincts and make that call saved her life and the lives of the other 2 women. But William does not feel like a hero. He feels guilt. He told me that he wishes he had called sooner, had trusted his concerns earlier, had pushed harder when the first welfare check came up empty. He wonders how much suffering he could have prevented if he had acted the first time he heard crying instead of talking himself into thinking it was probably nothing. William still lives in that building. He refused to move, though many residents left after the news coverage made the place infamous. The apartment upstairs has remained vacant. The building manager cannot find anyone willing to rent it despite professional cleaning and renovation. William says he is fine with that. He says the silence above him is better than wondering if he is hearing something he should report. He watches his neighbors more carefully now. We all do. The case opened our eyes to how these operations hide in plain sight, in normal apartment buildings, in normal neighborhoods. The couple seemed ordinary. Their patterns were unusual but not obviously criminal. And for weeks, women suffered just feet away from people who had no idea what was happening. The building manager installed additional security measures, cameras in the hallways, better locks, a policy requiring more thorough background checks on new tenants. But we all know that determined criminals find ways around security measures. The scariest part is not what happened. It is knowing that it could be happening right now in other buildings, in other cities, hidden behind closed doors where the only evidence is sounds that neighbors talk themselves into ignoring. William says he will never ignore concerning sounds again. He will never assume someone else will handle it. He will never talk himself out of making a call to police if something seems wrong. Because he learned the hardest way possible that your instincts exist for a reason, that thin walls in apartment buildings can carry sounds of suffering just as easily as sounds of normal life, and that sometimes being a good neighbor means being willing to seem paranoid or intrusive if it means someone trapped and terrified might get help. 3 women are alive today because William finally trusted what he was hearing and made that call. And somewhere out there, in other apartments, on other I-5 corridor cities, there might be other victims hoping someone is paying attention to the sounds coming through the walls. My best friend Ava was a late-night radio DJ in Portland, Oregon. She hosted the midnight to 6 a.m. shift on KPNW, an alternative rock station that served the greater Portland metro area. It was not a glamorous job, and the pay was barely above minimum wage, but Ava loved it. She loved the intimacy of late-night radio, the connection with listeners who called in during the loneliest hours. Insomniacs, night shift workers, long-haul truckers passing through the region, people dealing with heartbreak or anxiety or just unable to sleep. She would play their requested songs, chat with them on air, provide a voice in the darkness. For 3 years, that show was her passion and her purpose, until the night she received a call from someone who had been dead for 3 weeks. It was a Thursday in November 2016. Typical Pacific Northwest night. Rain coming down steady, temperature in the low 40s. Ava had started her shift at midnight, running through her usual opening, reading weather and traffic, playing the first set of songs. Around 1:30 a.m., the request line rang. Ava answered the way she always did. KPNW Nightline, you're on with Ava. What can I play for you tonight? The voice on the other end was a woman, probably in her 50s or 60s, with a soft quality that suggested someone kind and gentle. She said her name was Margaret, and that she had a very special request. She wanted Ava to play Unchained Melody by the Righteous Brothers and dedicate it to her husband Thomas. She said it was their song, had been since they met 42 years ago, and that she wanted him to hear it tonight because she missed him terribly. Ava loved these kinds of calls, the personal stories, the connections between songs and memories. She asked Margaret a few questions on air, the way she often did to make the dedication more meaningful. How did they meet? Margaret said they met at a college dance in 1974, that Thomas had been too shy to ask her to dance until that song came on. And then he found his courage. Where was Thomas tonight that he would be listening? Margaret said he was home, that they had been separated recently due to circumstances beyond their control, but that she hoped he was tuned in and would hear this message of love. Ava thought it was sweet, if a bit sad. Maybe they were going through a divorce or separation. Maybe Thomas was traveling for work. She queued up the song, gave a heartfelt introduction about Margaret and Thomas's 42-year love story, and let the music play. During the song, she logged the call in her system the way station policy required, noting the time, the caller's name, and the dedication details. The rest of the shift was normal. A few more calls, standard requests, some pleasant conversations with her regular listeners. Ava signed off at 6 a.m., exhausted but satisfied with the show. She drove home through the morning rain, slept until early afternoon, then got up to prepare for her next shift. It was her routine, her rhythm. 5 nights a week, midnight to 6, living her life in reverse of most people. The next day, around 8 p.m., Ava received a phone call on her personal cell. The number was unfamiliar, local area code. She answered, expecting maybe a listener who had gotten her number somehow, which happened occasionally, despite station policies. Instead, the voice on the other end was a man, older, speaking with barely controlled emotion. He said his name was Thomas Whitmore, and that he needed to speak with her about something that had happened on her show the previous night. Ava remembered the dedication immediately. She told Thomas that yes, his wife Margaret had called in and requested their song, and she hoped he had heard it. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then Thomas said something that made Ava's blood run cold. "Miss, my wife Margaret died 3 weeks ago. She had a heart attack in her sleep. I buried her on October 28th. There is no possible way she called your station last night." Ava felt the room spin. She told Thomas he must be mistaken, that she had spoken directly with a woman named Margaret who knew details about their relationship, about their song, about 42 years of marriage. Thomas said those details were correct, every single one, which was why he was calling, because someone had told him that his dead wife's voice had been on the radio at 1:30 in the morning, requesting the song they had danced to when they first met. And he needed to know if it was true. Ava asked who had told him. Thomas explained that his neighbor, a woman who worked night shift at a hospital and always listened to KPNW during her commute, had called him that morning in tears. She had heard the dedication, had heard Ava talking with a woman named Margaret Whitmore about her husband Thomas, and knew it was impossible because she had attended Margaret's funeral 2 weeks prior. The neighbor thought Thomas should know, though she had no explanation for what it meant. Ava told Thomas to come to the station. She would pull the archived recording of the show, and they could listen together. He arrived an hour later, a thin man in his 70s, grief etched into every line of his face. Ava met him in the lobby and brought him back to the production room, where she had already queued up the recording from the previous night. She warned him that this might be difficult to hear and asked if he was sure he wanted to listen. Thomas said he had to know. He had to hear if it was really her voice. Ava played the segment. Thomas listened to her answer the phone, listened to the conversation between Ava and the caller. When the woman's voice came through the speakers, identifying herself as Margaret, describing their meeting and their song, Thomas began to cry. Not quiet tears, deep, racking sobs that shook his entire body. Because the voice was unmistakably his wife. The tone, the inflection, the slight hesitation she always had before saying something emotional. It was Margaret, speaking on the radio, 23 days after her death. Ava did not know what to say. She sat with Thomas while he listened to the entire segment, while he heard his dead wife's voice dedicate their song to him, tell him she missed him, ask him to listen. When it ended, Thomas looked at Ava and asked a question she could not answer. How is this possible? They checked everything. The phone records from the station showed an incoming call at 1:32 a.m. to the request line. The number it came from was logged in the system. Ava called it while Thomas sat there. It rang 4 times, then went to voicemail. Margaret's voice on the recording. "You have reached Thomas and Margaret Whitmore. We cannot come to the phone right now, but please leave a message, and we will call you back." Thomas said he had not changed the voicemail greeting since Margaret died, could not bring himself to erase her voice. He still called his own number sometimes just to hear it. The phone that number connected to was sitting on his kitchen counter at home. He had been there all night the previous evening. The phone had not rung. No calls had been placed from it. Ava suggested maybe someone had spoofed the number, had somehow found Margaret's obituary online and made a cruel prank call. But that did not explain the voice. Voice recordings can be faked, sure, but this was a live conversation. Margaret had responded to Ava's questions in real time, had laughed at appropriate moments, had paused and thought before answering. It was not a recording. It was a conversation. The station manager reviewed the audio as well. She brought in a sound engineer to analyze the recording for any signs of manipulation or artificial generation. The engineer's conclusion was that the audio was clean, showed no signs of editing or synthesis. It was a standard phone call, recorded exactly as it happened. A woman had called the station, spoken with Ava, made a request, and ended the call. Nothing about the technical aspects of the recording was unusual in any way. Thomas asked Ava to keep a copy of the recording. She burned it to a CD for him, knowing station policy required her to delete personal copies, but unable to refuse this grieving man the chance to hear his wife's voice. Thomas thanked her, told her he did not understand what had happened, but that hearing Margaret say she missed him, that she still loved him after 42 years, brought him a peace he had not felt since her death. But Ava could not let it go. Over the next weeks, she researched paranormal phenomena, electronic voice phenomena, cases of calls from the deceased. She found numerous documented cases, though most involved brief cryptic messages or unclear audio. Nothing like the clear, extended conversation she had with Margaret. She considered consulting paranormal investigators, but what would they do? The call had already happened. The voice was already recorded. There was no ongoing phenomenon to investigate. Then, 6 weeks after the initial call, the request line rang again. It was 3:15 a.m. on a rainy December night, the station nearly empty except for Ava and the overnight board operator in the next room. Ava answered. "KPNW Nightline, you're on with Ava." The voice that responded was Margaret, the same gentle, kind tone. "Hello, dear. It is Margaret again. I have another request if you do not mind." Ava's hands went numb. She looked at the caller ID display. Same number, the Whitmore landline. She tried to keep her voice steady. "Margaret, I spoke with Thomas. He told me you passed away." "I know, dear. I know. But I wanted him to hear the song, and I knew you would play it for me. You have such a kind voice on the radio. People must tell you that all the time." Ava asked the question that had been haunting her. "How is this possible? How are you calling me?" Margaret's voice carried a warmth that somehow made the impossible seem almost normal. "I do not really understand it myself, dear, but I can reach the phone sometimes when conditions are right. When the rain is falling and the night is dark and lonely, I can make the connection just for a little while. I wanted to thank you for playing our song." Thomas heard it. He told me when he visited my grave the next morning. He sat there in the rain and told me all about hearing my voice on your show. Ava felt tears streaming down her face. "What would you like me to play tonight, Margaret?" "What a Wonderful World" by Louis Armstrong, for Thomas again. Because even though I am gone, it still is a wonderful world because he is in it. And tell him I will always be listening, even if he cannot hear me call anymore. Ava played the song. She dedicated it exactly as Margaret requested. And when the song ended, she checked the station's call log. The number was there. Duration, 3 minutes, 47 seconds. A real call from a real phone number. But when she called Thomas the next morning to tell him about it, he said the phone at his house had not rung, had not made any outgoing calls. He checked the phone records with his provider. No calls logged at 3:15 a.m. Ava quit the radio station 6 months later. She told people it was for career advancement, that she wanted to try television production instead. But the truth is, she could not handle the uncertainty anymore. The not knowing if another call would come. The fear that other voices might start calling in, voices of people who were not supposed to be able to make phone calls anymore. The station policy now is to play Margaret's requested songs twice a year without announcement or dedication. Once on October 28th, the day she died. Once on February 14th, Valentine's Day. They play Unchained Melody and What a Wonderful World back-to-back during the midnight hour. The station manager says it is a memorial, a way to honor a listener who loved their programming. But the overnight DJs know the real reason. They play those songs hoping Margaret is listening, hoping she feels remembered, and hoping she does not call the request line again. Because the question Ava could never answer, the question that made her leave radio entirely, was this: if Margaret could call, how many others could too? How many voices from beyond are waiting for the right conditions, the right dark, rainy night, the right loneliness to reach through and connect? How many phone lines become bridges when we least expect it? Ava lives in Seattle now, works in corporate communications, far from radio studios and request lines. But she told me that sometimes, late at night when she cannot sleep, she tunes into KPNW online, listens to whoever is hosting the overnight shift. And twice a year, on October 28th and February 14th. She listens for those two songs. When they play, she says a quiet thank you to Margaret for teaching her that love does not end when life does, that some connections are stronger than death, that sometimes the only thing impossible about impossible things is our refusal to accept them. Thomas still lives in Portland. He's 83 now, and twice a year, he sits by his radio in the early morning hours and listens to KPNW play his songs, the songs he shared with Margaret for 42 years. And he believes, the way Ava came to believe, that somewhere in the static between stations, in the electromagnetic space where voices travel through wires and air, Margaret is listening too, still loving him, still missing him, still waiting for the day when their connection can be permanent again, when the distance between them finally closes and the phone stops needing to ring. My cousin Benjamin went through a rough divorce in the spring of 2019. After 15 years of marriage, his wife left him for someone she had met at work, and Benjamin was devastated. He found himself suddenly alone in a house that felt too big, with friends who were really couple friends who did not know how to relate to him as a single person anymore. He fell into a depression that worried our whole family. He stopped going out, stopped answering phone calls, just went to work at his accounting firm, and came home to an empty house. His sister finally convinced him that he needed to do something, meet new people, find activities that would get him out of his isolation. Benjamin had always enjoyed hiking and done plenty of trails around Washington State when he was younger. So he went online and started looking for hiking groups, thinking that would be a safe, healthy way to meet people who shared an interest. He found what looked like a perfect fit. Pacific Northwest Trail Companions had an active presence on social media with hundreds of members. The photos showed groups of smiling people on beautiful trails, posts about weekend hikes to locations all over the Cascades and Olympics, friendly conversations in the comments. It seemed like exactly what Benjamin needed. He sent a join request and was accepted within hours. The group administrator, someone named Christopher, sent him a welcome message saying they had a hike planned for that weekend near Snoqualmie Pass and would love to have him join. It was described as a moderate difficulty hike, about 8 miles round trip, with a campout overnight at a scenic location. Perfect for someone getting back into hiking and wanting to meet the group. Benjamin felt hopeful for the first time in months. He responded that he would be there. Christopher sent detailed instructions. Meeting point was a trailhead parking area off I-90, date and time specified. Benjamin should bring standard camping gear, food for 2 days, water purification supplies. The message emphasized that cell service would be spotty once they got on the trail, so everyone should plan to stay together as a group. Christopher included a list of the 8 other hikers who would be attending, all with profile pictures and brief bios. Everyone looked normal, friendly, ranging in age from mid-20s to late 50s. Benjamin packed his gear that Saturday morning, feeling more optimistic than he had since the divorce. He drove to the meeting point, arriving about 15 minutes early. The parking area was exactly where Christopher said it would be. A small dirt lot that could fit maybe 10 vehicles. One other car was already there, an older SUV with hiking stickers on the back window. As Benjamin parked, people started arriving. By 9 a.m., there were 8 people, plus Christopher, exactly as planned. Christopher was in his early 40s, fit and tanned, with the easy confidence of someone who spent a lot of time outdoors. He welcomed everyone warmly, did introductions all around. The other hikers seemed nice, chatting easily, excited about the hike. Everything felt normal and welcoming. They divided up some communal supplies, checked everyone's gear, and set off up the trail around 9:30. The hike itself was beautiful. The trail wound through old growth forest, crossed a few streams, climbed steadily, but not too steeply. The group moved at a comfortable pace, Christopher leading, everyone chatting and getting to know each other. Benjamin found himself relaxing, enjoying conversations with a woman named Rachel who worked in tech, and a retired teacher named Paul. This was exactly what he needed. Connection, nature, distraction from the pain of his failed marriage. They hiked for about 4 hours, stopping for lunch at a clearing with views of the surrounding peaks. Christopher pulled out a map and showed everyone where they were headed. The campsite, he said, was another 2 miles ahead, at a remote lake that was not on most trail maps. A hidden gem that he had discovered years ago. Everyone was excited by the promise of a pristine, uncrowded location. The trail got narrower as they continued, less maintained. Christopher said this was expected, that they were leaving the official trail system for the last mile or so. Benjamin noticed that several of the other hikers were checking their phones and commenting that they had lost cell service completely. Christopher laughed and said that was part of the appeal, getting truly disconnected from the digital world for a night. They reached the lake around 4 in the afternoon. It was beautiful, exactly as described. A pristine alpine lake surrounded by forest, no signs of other campers. They set up tents, gathered firewood, started preparing dinner. Everything felt normal and pleasant. But as evening fell and the group gathered around the fire, the tone began to shift. Christopher started talking about the real purpose of the group. He said that modern society was failing, that people were too dependent on systems that were about to collapse, that economic and environmental catastrophe was imminent. Benjamin exchanged glances with Rachel, who looked uncomfortable. Christopher continued, pulling out literature from his pack, pamphlets and booklets about survivalism, about preparing for societal breakdown, about creating alternative communities away from government control. Benjamin realized with growing unease that this was not just a hiking group. This was recruitment. Christopher was charismatic and persuasive, talking about how the group owned property in remote areas, how they were building sustainable compounds, how they needed more people who were ready to abandon mainstream society and embrace a different way of living. He made it sound reasonable, logical, even appealing. Some of the other hikers were nodding along, clearly already convinced or in on the pitch, but Benjamin saw that he was not the only one who had been deceived. Rachel looked scared. Paul looked confused and uncomfortable. 2 other hikers, a young couple named Mark and Jennifer, were whispering to each other with worried expressions. Christopher said they would spend the next day discussing the philosophy and practical aspects of joining the community. That everyone should keep an open mind, that this was an opportunity most people never got. When Rachel said she wanted to leave, wanted to hike back out that night, Christopher's demeanor changed. The friendly guide became cold and aggressive. He said they were miles from the trailhead, that it was getting dark, that it would be dangerous to leave now, better to wait until morning, have the discussion, make informed decisions. Benjamin realized they were surrounded. The hikers, who were clearly part of the recruitment, 5 of them, had positioned themselves around the campfire in a way that blocked the obvious routes back to the trail. Christopher made it clear, without explicitly threatening, that leaving was not an option. They would all stay the night, they would all listen to what he had to say, and in the morning they could decide whether to join the community or go back to their failing society. Benjamin knew he had to get out. He had read about cult recruitment tactics during his divorce when he was trying to understand manipulation and control. This was textbook. Isolate the targets, present an alternative worldview, use group pressure, and implied threats to prevent departure. He needed to leave before morning, before things escalated. He waited until around 2 a.m. when most people were asleep. He quietly unzipped his tent, grabbed his pack, and started moving toward where he remembered the trail leading back. He made it about 50 yards before a flashlight beam caught him. 2 of Christopher's people, a man and woman, blocked his path. They did not speak, just stood there, making it clear he was not going anywhere. Benjamin made a decision. He dropped his pack and ran, not toward the trail but into the forest at an angle, hoping to circle around and find the trail on his own. He heard shouting behind him, heard people giving chase. He ran through the dark forest, branches whipping his face, roots trying to trip him. He had no light, no gear, just panic driving him forward. He ran for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes before he stumbled onto a logging road. He followed it downhill, reasoning that all roads lead somewhere. Dawn was breaking when he finally found a highway. He flagged down a truck driver who called the police. When authorities investigated, they found the lake, found the campsite, but found no one. The tents were gone, the fire pit cold, no evidence that anyone had been there recently. Christopher's social media group disappeared that same day. Every post deleted, every member removed, the page gone as if it never existed. The photos Benjamin had seen, the profiles of other members, all vanished. Police could not find any record of the group or anyone named Christopher matching the description. The other hikers Benjamin named could not be located. Rachel, Paul, Mark, Jennifer, none of them appeared in any missing persons databases. No one else came forward reporting similar experiences. Benjamin found a news article from 6 months earlier about a hiker who disappeared near Snoqualmie Pass and was never found. The man's family said he had mentioned joining a wilderness group he found online, but police found no evidence of such a group. Another article from a year before that, similar story. Hiker joined online group, went on trip, never returned. Benjamin still lives in Washington, but he deleted all his social media accounts. He never went hiking alone again, and he warns anyone who will listen about online groups that promise community and connection, because somewhere in the remote areas of the Pacific Northwest, survivalist groups are recruiting vulnerable people, isolating them, and making them disappear into compounds or worse. Benjamin escaped because he ran. The others at that campsite, the ones who stayed until morning, he does not know what happened to them. He hopes they refused the recruitment and went home. But part of him knows they probably did not. Part of him knows they are still out there, somewhere in the forests, living in compounds run by charismatic leaders, cut off from the world, believing society has collapsed when really they have just been made to disappear. My coworker Isabella did one of those ancestry DNA tests in the summer of 2020. It was during the height of the pandemic, when everyone was stuck at home, looking for ways to connect with something, anything beyond the four walls of their apartments. Isabella was working from home, feeling isolated, and thought it would be fun to learn more about her family heritage. She ordered a kit from one of the major DNA companies, spit in the tube, mailed it back, and forgot about it for a few weeks while she waited for results. When the email notification finally came, she was excited to see her ethnic breakdown, maybe find some distant cousins, learn something interesting about her roots. She had no idea that clicking on that email would connect her to 3 unsolved murders spanning over a decade. Isabella grew up in Spokane, Washington, in what she always described as a normal, quiet family. Her parents were both teachers. Her younger brother worked in IT. Her extended family consisted of aunts and uncles, and cousins she saw at holidays. Nothing dramatic, no family secrets that she knew of, just regular people living regular lives. Her father's brother, Uncle Richard, had died in a car accident in 1998, when Isabella was only 6 years old. She barely remembered him, just vague impressions of a tall man with a beard who gave good hugs and smelled like wood smoke. The family rarely talked about him. Grief, Isabella assumed. Sometimes people deal with loss by not talking about it. The DNA results showed exactly what Isabella expected. Northern European ancestry, primarily Scandinavian and German, matching what she knew about her family background. The ethnicity breakdown was interesting but not surprising. What caught her attention was the relative matches section. The DNA company had identified several people in their database who shared significant genetic markers with Isabella. Close relatives, most of them were expected. Her brother showed up as an immediate family match. A few second and third cousins she recognized by name. But there was one match that made no sense. A first cousin match, someone who shared enough DNA to be a direct niece or nephew, or a first cousin through a sibling of one of her parents. The profile was labeled only with a username, Justice Seeker 1976. No real name, no profile picture, no family tree attached. But the genetic relationship was undeniable. This person was closely related to Isabella, and she had no idea who they were. Isabella clicked on the profile to send a message, the standard feature these DNA sites provide for connecting with matches. She wrote a friendly note explaining that the DNA test showed them as close relatives, asking if the person knew how they might be connected, suggesting they compare family trees. She sent the message and went back to work, not thinking much of it. 3 days later, she received a response. But it was not from Justice Seeker 1936. It was from a detective with the Washington State Police Major Crimes Unit. The message was formal and carefully worded. It explained that the DNA profile Isabella had matched with was not a person looking for family connections. It was DNA evidence from unsolved homicide cases. The profile had been entered into the genetic genealogy database as part of an investigation using familial DNA matching techniques. And Isabella's DNA indicated that she was a close relative of the person whose DNA had been found at multiple crime scenes. Isabella felt her world tilt. She called the number the detective provided, barely able to process what she was reading. The detective, a woman named Sergeant Mitchell, explained the situation carefully and compassionately. 3 women had been murdered in Washington state between 1992 and 1998. All 3 cases remained unsolved. All 3 crime scenes had yielded DNA evidence, and that DNA matched across all 3 cases, confirming a single perpetrator. That DNA had been entered into criminal databases, but no matches had been found. Until recently, when advances in genetic genealogy made it possible to upload crime scene DNA to ancestry databases and search for familial matches. Isabella's DNA indicated she was closely related to the killer. Based on the amount of shared genetic material, the perpetrator was most likely her parent's sibling, or potentially a half-sibling of one of her parents. Sergeant Mitchell asked Isabella to provide detailed information about her family tree, particularly her parents' siblings. Isabella's mind immediately went to her mother's siblings, but her mother only had one brother who lived in California and could not possibly be involved. Her father had 2 siblings, one sister who lived in Texas and taught kindergarten, and one brother, Uncle Richard, the one who supposedly died in a car accident in 1998. Isabella told Sergeant Mitchell about Richard, provided what few details she knew. The detective asked if Isabella could provide photographs, any documentation, anything that might help identify and locate Richard. Isabella said she would ask her father and get back to her. Then Sergeant Mitchell said something that made Isabella's blood run cold. "Isabella, we need you to consider the possibility that your Uncle Richard may not have died in 1998, that the car accident story may have been a cover for something else. Would your father have any reason to lie about his brother's death?" Isabella confronted her father that evening. It was one of the hardest conversations of her life. She explained about the DNA test, about the match to unsolved murders, about the police asking questions about Uncle Richard. Her father went pale. He sat down heavily at the kitchen table and put his head in his hands. And then he told her the truth that the family had been hiding for 22 years. Richard had not died in a car accident. He had disappeared. In the summer of 1998, Richard had been living in a small town outside of Olympia, working odd jobs, not particularly close to the family. He had always been troubled, her father explained. Anger issues, problems maintaining relationships, a worldview that blamed others for his failures. In July of 1998, Richard had called their father, Isabella's grandfather, and said he was leaving, going off-grid. That society was corrupt, and he needed to live according to his own principles. He said not to try to find him, not to report him missing, that he was choosing to disappear. The family had been worried but also somewhat relieved. Richard's presence had always been disruptive, uncomfortable. They told people he had died in a car accident because it was easier than explaining that he had voluntarily cut ties with his entire family. Easier than admitting they had a family member who rejected them so completely. The fake accident story became family canon, repeated so often that younger members like Isabella grew up believing it as fact. But now, with Isabella's DNA test connecting Richard to multiple murders, the timeline made horrible sense. The murders had occurred in 1992, 1994, and 1998, the last one in June of 1998, just weeks before Richard had called to say he was disappearing. He had not left to live off-grid. He had fled because he was about to be caught, and the family's story about his death had provided him cover, made it so no one was looking for him, made it easy for him to create a new identity somewhere else. Sergeant Mitchell and her team moved quickly once Isabella provided the family information. They obtained photographs of Richard from the early 90s, ran them through facial recognition systems, cross-referenced with known aliases and identification documents. Within 2 weeks, they found him. Richard Moore, formerly Richard Anderson, living in a remote compound in eastern Oregon, part of a survivalist community that asks no questions about people's pasts. The arrest happened on a Tuesday morning. Isabella watched the news coverage in shock. Footage of police vehicles surrounding a rural property. A man in handcuffs being led out, looking older and harder than the uncle she barely remembered. The news identified him as a suspect in 3 cold case murders from the 90s, apprehended thanks to genetic genealogy techniques and family cooperation. The evidence was overwhelming. Richard's DNA matched the crime scene evidence perfectly. His vehicle from the 90s matched witness descriptions. His movements and locations corresponded with where and when the murders occurred. All 3 victims had been women he had encountered through work or social situations, women who had rejected his advances or perceived slights. The murders had been brutal, rage-driven. Prosecutors built a case that showed a pattern of escalating violence, culminating in the 1998 murder that had spooked him enough to disappear. The trial was in 2021. Isabella's family fractured under the weight of revelation. Her father was devastated, drowning in guilt for having covered for his brother, even unknowingly providing him protection with the fake death story. Some relatives refused to believe Richard was guilty, insisted the DNA evidence was planted or contaminated, that this was persecution. Others were horrified, couldn't reconcile the man they knew with the crimes he had committed. Isabella was called to testify about how her DNA test led to the investigation. She sat on the witness stand and explained the simple curiosity that had led her to spit in a tube, the shock of learning her DNA connected to unsolved murders, the unraveling of family lies. The defense attorney tried to suggest she had ulterior motives, that she had suspected her uncle all along. But Isabella's testimony was straightforward and credible. She had not known. None of them had known. They had just wanted to forget about Richard and move on with their lives. Richard was convicted on all 3 counts of first-degree murder. He received 3 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole. During his sentencing hearing, he showed no remorse. He claimed the women deserved what happened to them, that they had disrespected him, that he was simply enacting justice. He said he had created a new life in Oregon, that he had found peace in his survivalist community, and that he would have continued living that life if Isabella had not interfered with her DNA test. He looked directly at her and said she had betrayed family by cooperating with police. Isabella has not submitted to any interviews about the case. She deleted her DNA profile from the Ancestry site, though the damage was already done. She wonders constantly about the implications. If she had not taken that test, Richard would still be free, living under an assumed identity in Oregon. The families of his victims would still have no answers, no closure, but her own family would not have been destroyed by the revelation that they had harbored a murderer, even unknowingly. She thinks about the 3 women whose lives Richard took. Jennifer Hartley, murdered in 1992 at age 26. Michelle Torres, murdered in 1994 at age 31. Denise Carlson, murdered in 1998 at age 24. All of them with families who spent decades wondering what happened, who killed their daughters, sisters, mothers. Isabella's DNA test gave them answers. Her cooperation with police gave them justice, but it came at the cost of her own family's sense of identity and peace. The DNA database companies now include warnings when people sign up, information about how DNA can be used in criminal investigations, how familial matching can implicate relatives, how that simple tube of spit might reveal family secrets better left buried. But how many people actually read those warnings? How many people understand the implications? Isabella still works at the same company where we met. She rarely talks about what happened unless directly asked, but I know she struggles with complicated feelings. Pride that she helped solve 3 murders. Guilt that her curiosity destroyed her family. Fear about what other secrets might be lurking in genetic databases, waiting for someone to innocently match with them. She told me recently that she wonders how many other cold cases are waiting to be solved through genetic genealogy. How many killers are living under assumed identities, feeling safe because they disappeared before DNA databases existed. How many families have constructed careful lies to cover for relatives they wanted to forget. And how many curious people will order ancestry tests in the coming years, expecting to learn about their ethnic heritage, only to discover that their DNA connects them to crimes they never knew happened. Richard is in prison. The families have answers, and Isabella lives with the knowledge that sometimes the truth destroys more than it heals. But that does not make revealing it wrong, just painful, unavoidably, irreversibly painful.